So welcome, John, to our virtual OEA network. We're really happy to have you today. I'm going to pass it over to Mike to give a quick introduction, and then Yanir will start us off with some questions.
All right, thank you, Katie.
You're welcome.
So, as you know, we have a very special guest, John Barry. The National Academies of Science named his 2000 book, The Great Influenza, the year's best book on science or medicine, and it was a #1 New York Times bestseller. He was the only non-scientist on a federal government infectious disease board of experts, served on the original team which recommended public health measures to mitigate a pandemic, advised the White House and the Bush and Obama administrations on pandemic preparedness and response, and is the only non-scientist ever to give the National Academies of Science Abel Wolman Distinguished Lecture. John's articles have appeared in such scientific journals as Nature and Journal of Infectious Disease, and such lay publications as New York Times, Esquire, Time, and the Washington Post. And he has been on the guest broadcast network in the United States, appearing on such shows as NBC's Meet the Press, PBS The NewsHour, and NPR's All Things Considered. He has served on numerous boards, including at MIT, Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, and is a distinguished scholar at Tulane University School of Public Health and Tropical Medicine. And with that, Mr. John Barry.
Thank you. Sounds good.
So if we follow the question and answer format, I think it would be very good to not assume that people know about the 1918 pandemic and really what happened at the time. What was the disease? What was the basic thing that what went on? Could you set the stage for us?
Sure. First, there are a lot of similarities and parallels and some significant dissimilarities with what's going on today. Similarities. For one thing, obviously, it was a new virus that jumped species and entered the human population. There was essentially no immunity to it. There was some bit of cross protection from prior influenza viruses, which I think accounted for the fact that in the Western world, the case fatality rate was much less than in the less developed world, which had never seen an influenza virus. But basically a naive population. Also a respiratory virus, of course, so the mode of transmission was identical to COVID. Airborne, droplets, perhaps some fomites, but I think there might be a little bit more fomite transmission in influenza than with COVID, but not much with either. The virus in 1918 was capable of affecting every organ in the body, quite literally from the testes to the brain. The differences were noticed on autopsy on essentially every organ, including the brain. There was, neurological complications in 1918 were, if anything, greater than they are right now. It came in waves. There were variants. The first wave in 1918 was really quite mild. It was so mild you could see read medical journal articles. I think it was BMJ, if I remember rightly, that actually said this looks and smells like influenza, but it's not killing enough people, so it can't be influenza. That was the first wave. Probably the best contemporary study after the pandemic, published in 1927, noted that the first wave was not particularly transmissible. It said, quote, had a tendency to peter out, unquote, quote, lacked the penetrating power of the second wave, unquote. So you had a variant emerge in the summer of 19. That first wave occurred, probably started, the first noticed cases were probably in late February. And then in March, it spread and went through Europe. It's fact, it's called the Spanish influenza. We don't really know where it started, but we do know it didn't start in Spain. It picked up the name Spanish influenza because Spain was not at war and was writing about it freely. And the countries at war were largely muted. They didn't want to say anything that might affect morale. So you had this mild first wave, not particularly transmissible. The second wave was highly transmissible, went everywhere, and was quite lethal. The death toll is an estimated 50 to 100 million in a much smaller worldwide population. If you adjust for population, it would be equivalent to about 225 to 450 million people today. Most of the deaths probably were from secondary bacterial pneumonias, but there clearly were many deaths from direct involvement of the virus, cytokine storms, and so forth. There was, interestingly, if you were sick in the first wave, you got up to 94% protection against second wave. And for those of you who know what current influenza vaccines are like, that's extraordinary. The best influenza vaccine ever developed was 61% effective. It's usually in the 30s or 40s. So that protection was really unusual. You then got a third wave in, I would say, over 2.5 year period or so, 2-3 year period. Probably 2/3 of the deaths would be my guess, although the data is not great on this, were compressed into 14 or 15 weeks in the fall of 1918. It was a very intense period. In March of 1919, you got a third wave, which did not hit everywhere. It was significantly less lethal than the second wave, but it was clearly lethal. It was much more deadly than the first wave. Interestingly, if you were sick in the first or second wave, you had no protection whatsoever against infection in the third wave. So obviously that variant developed, which escaped immunity and certainly is parallel to today. Some of there was then, in fact, I had an op-ed in Monday's Times online. They actually just told me that it'll be in the Sunday Review section this weekend, in which I was talking about the fact that most of the histories of the pandemic, including the CDC website,
Yes.
speak only about 3 waves in the pandemic. In fact, there was a 4th wave that hit in 1920. And this way, in some cities in the US and probably around the world, but I don't have data from around the world, but in Detroit, Milwaukee, Minneapolis, Kansas City, and some other places, the 4th wave was actually deadlier than even the second wave. Overall, however, it was roughly equal to the 3rd wave. The data that I have on the 4th wave suggests that it hit people who were not previously infected. There was a door-to-door survey of 10,000 people in Boston by some pretty good epidemiologists who found 85% of the people sick had not been sick in earlier waves. There was a similar observation in Detroit, although it wasn't quantified. In 1921, however, things returned to pre-pandemic normals. I think partly that was because of the immune protection, which by then essentially 100% of the population had. At the same time, the virus was mutating. The original 1918 virus could infect, like SARS-CoV-2, both the lung directly, could bind to cells in the lung, which made it lethal, and it could bind to cells in the upper respiratory tract, which made it highly transmissible. SARS-1, well, it's not, I don't want get into exactly that. But clearly, the 1918 virus lost the ability to bind to cells deep in the lung. Ordinary seasonal influenza does not do that, or at least not on as a general rule. I imagine there must be some occasions where it happens, but it's very unusual. The 1918 virus was pretty good at binding to cells directly in the lung, but by 1921, as I said, the numbers were just like ordinary seasonal influenza, up and down each year. There was a significant uptick in 1928, which led the Congress to create the National Institutes of Health. You might think that Congress would have acted right after the pandemic, but no, they needed a reminder. And that virus continued to circulate until it was replaced by the 1957 pandemic virus. So, in terms of differences, I already mentioned the lethality.
John, let me ask a couple of other questions, if I might. Yeah. So, could you describe the dynamics of the disease in a person, right? Because you described in your book, someone gets infected, what happens next?
Yeah. Well, most people, of course, even in 1918, at least in the West, hadn't what we are all familiar with, an ordinary attack of influenza. But for those unfortunate enough where the virus did bind to the lung, that was something entirely different. The cyanosis could be extreme enough that in the book I quoted a physician who said he couldn't distinguish African-American soldiers from white soldiers because the cyanosis was so intense. Some of that obviously spread rumors of the Black Plague and so forth. Probably the most frightening symptom was bleeding. There are reports that 15% of where the military data is very good, and there's a lot of it. In some Army camps, 15% of the people sick had nosebleed. There were also reports of people bleeding from the ears, even from their eyes, and from every mucosal membrane, including vaginal bleeding, which was initially confused with menstruation. The disease, the symptoms could be pretty much anything. It was initially misdiagnosed as cholera and typhoid, and even dengue, which was known as breakbone fever. So it gives you a sense of what those symptoms are like.
How long did it take? What was the course of the disease in time?
Yeah, one of the big differences between influenza and COVID is duration. Everything about influenza moves faster than COVID. The incubation period, even with Omicron, which is a lot faster than earlier variants, it's still slower than influenza. How long you shed virus, and so forth and so on. So, we've probably all had influenza at one point. You're sick. Your first symptoms, it's a sudden onset, and when you're sick. I mean, people could report basically being hit by a truck. In the really severe cases, it's anecdotal, but from very, very credible observers of people dying in as little as 12 hours after the first symptom.
I think this is really important from understanding disease differences and what is the difference. So you described that there would be train cars or something like that. Why don't you describe that?
Right. There are reports from. I didn't get this from a primary source, but I thought a reasonably credible secondary source, where trams in South Africa, which was pretty hard hit. Someone got on the trolley, and he got off, and half the people on the car were deceased, including the driver. It was horrific. There are studies from another major difference, possibly the biggest difference between that and COVID is the demographic of who was sick. The most vulnerable population in 1918 was children under 10, and particularly children under 5. Cotter Mesher, who's a friend of mine and was then in the White House and is one of the heroes of Michael Lewis's book, so you may know his name. Lewis wrote a pretty interesting book called Premonition, although I have some quibbles with it. But Carter did a computation and figured that the deaths of children under 5 equaled all-cause mortality for that age bracket over a period of 26 years today. So think of the impact on a society or on a parent, on a family with that kind of death toll compressed into a period of a few weeks. The next area of the target was otherwise healthy young people. There are studies of hospitalized pregnant women that ranged from 21% to 71% case mortality. There was a peak at age 28 of death. The excess mortality for people over 65 was less than 5% of the total excess mortality. So 95% of the excess mortality was people younger than 65. So obviously that's a huge difference between what's going on today.
I think that's good. I mean, if you want to say more, go ahead. But I wanted to go on to the government response issues.
Well, I was just going to say one more thing. I already mentioned the duration. The waves lasted for a much shorter time in 1918. And when they were gone, they seemed to be gone. And people didn't know that another one was coming. And so the stress, it was much more intense than today, much more tragic than today. But the stress on the economy and the duration, what we've gone through today is actually probably greater than what it was in 1918. So I will stop my more or less presentation at that point. And
so let's go on to the next question, which is, So Carlos is actually asking a very good question. He's saying the percentage of the population that was over 60 or 65 was probably a lot smaller than it is today. So that might have played some role in the percentage.
Well, yes and no. I mean, you're comparing it to a certain baseline. Okay. So the baseline in you had a baseline in 1918, and you're comparing the excess mortality of that baseline. Okay. So the absolute numbers shouldn't come into it.
Absolutely. So let's go on to talk about the government response. And you kind of laid out quite a bit in your book about what happened with the government response. Why don't you go ahead and describe that?
Sure. We were at war. And I think at no time in American history, really, including the McCarthy period, and the various Red Scares, did the government put as much effort into making the population think a certain way. And all this, and there was voluntary censorship, although there was a law that threatened 20 years in prison if anyone criticized the government. But there was voluntary censorship by virtually every newspaper in the United States. And incidentally, speaking about that law, they actually sent a congressman to jail for 10 years or sentenced one to jail. It was overturned by the Supreme Court. So they enforced that quite rigorously. So the government didn't want any bad news about anything. I already referred to the name the Spanish flu, and that's why it's called the Spanish flu. But as a result, they minimized the impact of the pandemic. You had a national public health leader saying this is ordinary influenza by another name. You had another public health national leader saying you have nothing to worry about if proper precautions are taken. And this was echoed by almost every local public health leader, by almost every local newspaper. I mean, for example, in Little Rock, at a time when you have a report in an Army base a few miles outside from a doctor, actually Rockefeller Institute guy, very good scientist, saying we have here nothing but death and destruction. We have thousands of soldiers sick, hundreds dying. A few miles away in Little Rock, the Little Rock newspaper has a big headline: influenza, same old fever and chills. But the medium is the message, and the message is daily life. When your neighbor is dying horrifically with horrific symptoms in 48 hours, when you see children dying, it's not ordinary influenza by another name. So the trust and authority disintegrated, and it disintegrated very rapidly. What was left was essentially chaos. Right now, we're in a very different situation. You have two belief systems. You have a majority of the people who believe Tony Fauci, and you have a minority of people who believe, in hydroxychloroquine and so forth, and essentially nonsense. It's become part of their identity, but they're firm believers in it. In 1918, you were completely at sea. You knew what you were being told was a lie, but you had nothing that you could believe in with any sense of certainty. It was even in that way, I think, a more unsettling situation. I think ultimately society is based on trust, and without trust, society begins to fray. I tell you how bad it got. I quoted Victor Vaughan, who was a very serious guy. He was a very important figure in American medicine, a dean of the University of Michigan Medical School. During the war, head of communicable diseases for the Army. And he said it just as it peaked, that if the current rate of acceleration continues for a few more weeks, civilization could easily disappear from the face of the earth. That's how bad it got at its peak. Of course, obviously that didn't happen because the pandemic did recede. But a lot of that, you have reports of people starving to death, not because there wasn't any food, but because there was so much fear that no one would bring food to these families, including, close relatives. You have reports of that not only in big cities, but in rural areas where you would expect family and community to be everything.
If we can, why don't you pick, I understand that there were some places where they did better in communicating what was going on, and some places worse.
Yeah, I use San Francisco as an example. And I don't know if it had anything to do with the fact that San Francisco had gone through the earthquake a decade earlier or not. It could be a coincidence that might have been a factor. But unlike other cities where the local public health leader was echoing the national leader, this is ordinary influenza by another name. In San Francisco, the mayor and other public officials, the leaders of the business community, trade union leaders, medical leaders, all put their names on a full-page ad in the newspaper. It ran a few times. In huge print, it said, "Wear a mask and save your life." Now, the masks they were wearing then, I think, were pretty useless. But that is a very different message than this is ordinary influenza by another name. And San Francisco seemed to function much better than most other cities. in terms of being able to deliver care and even food, to the extent that there are reports that when schools were closed in almost every city, but not all of them. In fact, New York and Chicago didn't close schools, but almost every city did. When the teachers, when the schools closed, they volunteered as everything from telephone operators to ambulance drivers, which obviously would have been a high risk thing to volunteer for. But there was a greater sense of community and helping each other. And in most disasters, there is, I think people tend to come together. I'm in New Orleans. I can tell you in Katrina, there was a real sense of community, and there was plenty of heroism in Katrina. Not to say that there wasn't in 1918. There was, particularly from doctors and nurses. If you look at JAMA in those days, you would see page after page of death notices in the tiniest print of doctors who had died. But there was this fraying, as I said, and this lack of trust and this fear that developed, even to the extent, and in fact, here's an example. There are rumors spread that, or another similarity between COVID and 1918, it infected other mammals essentially every mammal, dogs, cats, seals. Humans gave pigs H1N1 in 1918. But when there was a rumor spread in Phoenix that dogs were a source of influenza, people started killing their pets. And in Katrina, people refused to be rescued unless the pets could go with them. The Coast Guard actually had to change their policy on that. And this was a life-threatening situation, but they wouldn't leave their pets. And in Phoenix, they're killing them. So it was, trust is important. It keeps society together.
Yeah. So let's now go into the, what can we learn? Now, one of the challenges, of course, is that 1918 influenza pandemic is one instance of an experience, and it's kind of hard to know how we can generalize from one case to another. But please, you've been advising governments for a long time. What are the key messages that you feel are the ones to be learned?
Well, there are two. The first is tell the truth, and the second is, I think, that NPIs work, and the two are intertwined. I know that in the Bush administration, I was part of sort of conceptualizing a plan. I didn't get in any detail or into the subsequent process of it when it was actually written, but I did talk to a lot of people. And what I always brought to those meetings was telling, in my words, people talk about transparency, which is what it is, but I prefer saying bluntly, tell the truth. And I don't like this whole field of risk communication because it implies managing the truth. I say you don't manage the truth, you tell the truth, although obviously you do have to figure out exactly what you want to say, not in the sense of worrying so much about you don't want to scare people, but you can't say everything. You have to be somewhat selective. And people, if you don't tell them the truth, they're going to figure it out soon. And you're going to lose credibility. And you're not going to get any compliance. That's why I say the NPIs and the messaging are intimately linked to each other. By the same token, although I'm a firm advocate of NPIs, I don't want to overrate what I think they can accomplish. I used to get into arguments with modelers over that. There are limits. By the same token, if you look at some country, Australia comes to mind. what they've done in the last 2 years. In places like Australia, NPIs have been more effective than I think the strongest advocates ever imagined they could be.
So let's talk about, I think that there are, I think that you've really laid out a very powerful case, and really the opportunity for the public, for communities to take ownership of outcomes through NPIs is surely a key message that we would like to be carried forth. There are a lot of questions that have been posted in the chat, but maybe we can get people to articulate their questions. Why don't we start with
yeah, I've been tracking the questions, and I was planning on calling on folks in order. So
please do.
We'll start that now. So thanks everyone for your questions and your enthusiasm, and thanks John for this great information so far. So Carlos, we'll start with you if you would like to start with your question. I'm going to go down the list in the order in which people posted their interest and questions.
So it was already answered. Thank you.
Thank you, Carlos. All right, we'll move on to Tracy.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi there. Yeah, so my question was, Mr. Berry, he did touch on it briefly with San Francisco and that Bay Area, but my question was, were there any actions that stood out as being transformative of the places that did well? Like, was there anything specifically that stood out as being transformative? I know Johnny said the truth, telling the truth, and was there anything else specifically in terms of NPIs or strategy?
Well, I thought during the course of researching the book, trying to figure out, there's wide variety in mortality from one city to another. And I tried to look for a pattern, and frankly, I couldn't find one. One of the confounders was the fact that New York had a relatively mild experience. On a per capita basis, 33,000 deaths, if you want to consider that mild. But they never did anything. They did probably less than any city. Chicago also did very, very little, almost nothing. And they had a relatively mild experience. Both of them, however, had a spring wave, a pronounced spring wave, which did not get everywhere. So in the course of looking at the book, I was not convinced that NPIs were that significant. However, there have been some pretty systematic studies. One of them, the first was by Carter Messer, whom I mentioned earlier, who was then in the White House and the National Security Council, along with his colleague Richard Hatchett, who now runs COVAX and ran BARDA for a while. And they did a systematic look at what cities did, and they concluded that the NPIs did make a difference in morbidity and mortality. There was also a study that was funded by DOD and run by Howard Markell at the University of Michigan and Marty Cetrone at CDC, which found the same thing. So I am perfectly happy to accept those studies. And, plus obviously, I mentioned Australia earlier. You look at what has been accomplished there, 3,000 deaths, equivalent to about 35,000 in the United States on a per capita basis. So clearly those things did work, but I can't really answer your question because they were not apparent unless I didn't do a national city by city analysis. I was writing a narrative. I was trying to understand the course of the disease, but I didn't have the resources to look at every city systematically and compare and contrast. But the differences were not apparent to the eye. you really had to look pretty deeply at events to figure them out. As I said, I attributed what happened in New York and Chicago to spring wave, and I'm sure they had to be because they didn't employ any NPIs or nothing of any consequence. So obviously, spring exposure was one of the factors that affected things and confused interpretations.
Do you think that the caring for people may have also been a factor in that you said that people were terrified, and as a result, people died probably because they were not cared for where they perhaps may have survived. So the fact that people were terrified and perhaps there was more care in San Francisco area, and therefore their death rate was not as bad.
Well, I think that's a good question. I think that, number one, there wasn't a lot you could do for anybody anyway, other than keep someone hydrated. I don't think that would account for pretty significant discrepancies between cities and outcomes. It probably had some minor impact. You had, an enormous effort by people in healthcare. In fact, from the time I got involved in preparedness until 2 years ago, I would always, every time I gave a talk, I would raise one question. One that we don't know the answer to is whether the healthcare system, whether workers might have the courage to expose themselves to a lethal infectious disease, but would they want to risk going home and taking that to their families? We obviously know the answer to that question now. Yeah, the healthcare workers have behaved with extraordinary courage. Even though in 1918, you knew if you were going into medicine, you were going to face infectious disease. That was part of the game. But I'm sure there were differences in care. I'm sure some people died because they weren't hydrated. But I doubt that it varied that much city to city.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Tracy.
Okay, I had another question, but I will leave it to the end after everybody else, so everyone else gets a turn.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks for those questions, Tracy.
Yes. All right.
All right. Mike, you had a question.
Yeah. John, you talked about Philadelphia. I asked you earlier about it as being one of the hot spots. Can you describe what was going on in Philadelphia and what was their biggest mistakes?
Yeah, well, Philadelphia was run by one of the most corrupt political machines in the country, probably worse than Tammany. I'll tell you how bad it was. In the middle of the pandemic, the mayor was indicted not for sticking his hand in somebody's pocket, but as an accessory to murder. I mean, they were thugs in the political machine in Philadelphia. And they were largely run by saloon owners, or backed strongly, and they were reluctant to do anything. They had a Liberty Loan parade scheduled for September 28th. A lot of cities did at that time. Influenza had already gotten to the city and was spreading, and the medical community was urging the public health commissioner to cancel the parade. He was a perfectly nice guy, but he didn't have any backbone. The parade went forward, and like clockwork, incubation period influenza's 24 to 72 hours, and boom, influenza exploded. That came after the national draft had actually been canceled on September, 2 days before the parade, because the Army camps were already overrun with influenza, and they didn't want anybody else going to the camps. So it was not as though influenza was not known at that time. There was no ignorance. So that would be one example, and that would be, I focused a lot on in Philadelphia. I couldn't write about every city, and it would have gotten incredibly redundant. The book was designed for a popular audience. But Philadelphia was, and that was a city where Again, they lied as much as they did in any city in the country. To the extent, maybe my favorite anecdote about that is when Philadelphia finally, belatedly, closed schools, banned public gatherings, closed churches, saloons, of course, everything. One of the newspapers actually said, I remember it well, this is a direct quote, "This is not a public health measure. There is no cause for alarm." I mean, how stupid did they think people were? Anyway, so that was Philadelphia.
All right, thanks, John. Next, Stanley, would you like to raise your question?
Hey, sorry, I was trying to figure out how to enable my mic and webcam. So I think my question has to do with the compare and contrast between the influenza pandemic and COVID-19. Tracy already mentioned the factor of social media. I would like to hear your commentary on the difference of air travel between then and now affecting how let's say how the virus is being spread, because people are traveling a lot more now, and also how it's lengthening duration of the pandemic.
Well,
Thanks.
yeah,
And you're muted, by the way.
I didn't hear
You
you.
can mute it. That's fine.
Okay. I mean, obviously, air travel spread a virus in a matter of hours. In 1918, it took a lot longer. But there was a remarkable simultaneity in 1918, especially considering the difference in travel times. And what that would indicate is a couple of things. I mean, for example, in early September on multiple continents, the second wave erupted within, a couple of weeks of each other. So that means, number one, the first wave had to seed itself around the world, which it did. And second, there had to have been convergent evolution, because this second wave lethal version of the virus, which was also extremely transmissible, that was basically the same on different continents simultaneously without air travel, when it took at least a week to get anywhere. So that would not, in North America, you could sort of track the disease from the Northeast by railroad and ship down the coast, and around New Orleans was probably the earliest southern city hit, major port, obviously. And then it moved inland and got to the West Coast slower. But, at the same time, it was in Africa. Almost to the same day, there were cases erupting in Africa and in Boston that were, the first versions of the second wave virus. So I don't see how it could have spread without air travel. So the only other explanation is the virus is evolving in the same direction in different places.
Thank you, John. Next up, we have Tiffany James. All right, we will move to Wendy. Tiffany, if you're not ready.
I have two questions for you, John, and I'll take the most important one first. If you were to write a new book, what do you think would be the biggest scandal of this pandemic? Do you think it could be that we actually managed to convince a majority of the population in almost every country of the world to actually back the herd immunity train, even though that it's apparent to many of us that it's actually an economic driving force here? How did they manage to do that and put economy in front of lives, which is my personal opinion?
Well, I think the number one, obviously, I don't think Trump has to be number one. As no one in public health ever imagined. I know a lot of people in the preparedness community. I can tell you nobody ever in any of their planning anticipated as one of the scenarios a White House that was actively undermining every recommendation from the public health community. That clearly is number one. I think in this instance, if this had been 1918 and you had virus as lethal as that, or even if it was no more lethal, but it was hitting people in their 20s instead of people who were, 75, 80 in nursing homes, you would have a very, very different response than what we have had. I think the fact that it was primarily the elderly, also that it moved in different geographic regions at different times. I think one of the mistakes was probably closing down the entire country at the same time, including areas where there was no virus and no spread, no community spread. I think that did not help you politically, and I don't know that it helped you epidemiologically either. But that combination of primarily the fact that it was the elderly who were dying, it gave. I mean, you do have to balance economic and impacts and collateral damage. Nobody suggested in 2009. You all lived through 2009. Which incidentally, like that was almost two entirely different pandemics. The overwhelming majority of people, it was less dangerous than ordinary seasonal influenza. For the tiny minority that got sick, severely ill, it was 1918. And the average age of death was in the 30s, a little bit older than 1918, but not by much. But nobody would have suggested in 2009 that you close things down. In 1957, which was a moderate pandemic, not like what we're going through now, certainly not like 1918, the Association of State and Territorial Health Commissioners gathered in Washington. They decided not to do anything. So you have to weigh those things. I think the killer here was the lack of support and the effort to undermine the steps that were taken. So it wasn't really a surprise to me that there were these people saying the economy is more important. I think that really came out of the White House primarily. You would have had people shouting it in any instance, but if Trump had done even a reasonably competent job, I think all those things would have been muted.
But if we look at that, because okay, Trump's a Republican, but I actually live and work in Sweden as a teacher in a school.
Okay.
And Sweden has a socialist government, and the socialist government here said nothing. So we were not allowed masks in school. There's no HEPA filters. There's no carbon dioxide meters. There's absolutely nothing whatsoever. We have a death rate that is 6 to 10 times higher than our Nordic neighbors in
Triple
Norway.
Denmark's, 6 times Norway's, 8 times Finland's.
Yes.
Your economy.
And so we've done the opposite.
No economic benefit from that either.
No. So
zero.
A socialist government is not locking down at all, but not accepting any responsibility for the consequences of their actions.
Well, it's a democratic country, so it's up to the voters. They made, as you know better than I, a conscious decision to, they thought they were doing the right thing, playing the long game, figuring you can't keep the virus in a box forever. And whenever you relax the restrictions, you're going to have the same impacts anyway, so you may as well not have it. You know, there was a logic to it. I didn't agree with the logic. The results prove, in my view, and I think in yours, that they made the wrong decision. But, you know, again, there was a logic to it. They thought it was the best thing to do, and that over the course of the pandemic that they would be proven right, even if in the immediate aftermath of the decision, they looked pretty bad. In fact, 2 years later, they still look pretty bad. You know, I don't know what was in their heads, only what they articulated publicly. Again, you know more about it than I do.
Thank you. Tiffany James is able to speak. We just have to give her a moment to unmute. So thank you, Wendy, for your question.
Thank you for your patience. Sorry. I have my question in the chat, and I just want to go to it and read it really quick. Let's see. Katie, do you see my question? It's buried now, I think.
Yeah, I can read it.
Okay, thank you.
Of course. In your book, you talked about the U.S. waging total war where there were sacrifices the public was forced to make, like Meatless Monday, Wheaties meals, gasless Sunday, etc. Why do you think the government had the public make sacrifices in the wartime, but not sacrifices during the virus time?
Well, I mean, it was a wartime. You know, they were just, you know, Wilson was an obsessive compulsive personality. Everything in his psyche was geared toward winning the war, and he wanted, you know, as one of his aides said, he wanted to turn the country into one white hot mass of patriotism. So all those sacrifices that you asked about or cited, you know, were made to further the war effort. And, you know, Wilson viewed the influenza pandemic as interfering with the war effort. So he tried to basically steamroll right over it.
Well, thank you. Chloe, you had a comment or a question.
Oh, yeah.
I want to say thank you. I'm sorry, it took me a while to get back to unmute, but thank you.
Oh, thank you, Tiffany.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, in the 2009 pandemic, I knew people who pulled their kids out of school, and, you know, people had, like, if you had insurance, you can get immediate access to antivirals. So that was like a little bit of a difference, but I don't see that that's been the case, you know, in the 1918. It seemed more indiscriminate maybe than in 2009 or even now.
Well, I'm not sure exactly what you're asking.
Well, maybe I'm wrong about that, like that the wealthy have largely been able to avoid the worst of the current pandemic. And I knew that to be the case in 2009.
That's yeah, I mean, socioeconomic factors are certainly important in terms of mortality, morbidity. Not so much in the sense of care, because there was so little that could be done in 1918.
So it was
in terms of spread, you know, there was a pretty careful study and came up with exactly the conclusions that you would expect, that, you know, the amount of square footage per person in a dwelling affected how much spread there was in that dwelling. So that's obviously related to wealth. You know, but again, other than hydration, you know, aspirin, there just was so little that treatment that could be done. there actually were, for the people who had bacterial pneumonia, and I think probably a majority of the deaths were bacterial pneumonia. It's hard to say how much. Jeff Taubenberger is a very good scientist who's spent the last 25 or 30 years looking at 1918, including reconstituting the virus, digging it up, and so forth. He thinks that 95% of the deaths were bacterial. I disagree. I think there's, too many. Either I don't know of any actual data that distinguishes between how many people died in less than 4 days and how many more than 4 days. But there were clearly an enormous number of people who died pretty rapidly, and those were not bacterial pneumonias. Even today, bacterial pneumonia following influenza is about an 8% case mortality rate. And if it's antibiotic resistant, then you're talking about 30%, which is the same as 1918. But again, there was so little that, and I started to say they actually developed vaccines against bacterial pneumonias that they did not get widely distributed. They did have oxygen, but that was even less widely distributed. If you were lucky enough to have a secondary bacterial infection caused by a vaccine that happened to have been developed against that particular pathogen, then the vaccines actually might have had some impact. But obviously, they're not going to work against the virus itself. And those I think were, outside the military, there were very few places that developed those vaccines. I don't know how widely distributed they were, but laboratories in different cities where there was good scientific infrastructure, which is not too many places in 1918, they would develop their own vaccines.
All right. Thank you, John. Thank you, Chloe, for that. Last questions from the audience. We're going to turn back to Yanir. It is about 6 p.m. Eastern time. We're on the hour here. So I'll have one more comment or question from Yanir, and we will wrap up. Thank you, everyone. Yanir.
Great. John, so thank you very much. It's been very, very interesting. And I have a challenging question. For those of you who don't know, John was a football coach before he wrote his best-selling books. And really, I want to ask you this question because it's super important. The challenge of NPIs that you talked about and the challenge of being honest is a challenge of teamwork, a challenge of galvanizing people in the face of an external threat, which in sports, people do a lot, right? They rise to the occasion, they bring a can-do attitude, they respond to, and they put in huge amounts of effort in football, as you know, in order to win a game. And let's talk about the challenge of responding to the pandemic. How do we, how would you as a coach advise leaders or advise thought leaders to inspire that kind of shared effort that would make the difference in confronting this pandemic?
Well, just preach unity and tell the truth. The only time in Trump's presidency where his popularity or approval, I guess, cracked 50% was right after he said we're at war with the virus. People wanted to come together. Had he done a good job with the pandemic, I think he probably would have been reelected. So hopefully that's a lesson to other politicians in the future that doing the right thing is good, is in your own self-interest. But people do want to come together, but it requires leadership to bring them together. And part of that leadership is telling the truth. You know, Churchill's famous blood, sweat, and tears. You know, I remember participating in multiple pandemic games, essentially war games, and I would always preach that, and I would expect a lot of opposition in whatever team I was, but I was always, you know, it was like pushing against an open door. People tended to agree with me, and we would go out, and our first move would be a blood, sweat, and tears speech. You know, had, you know, that, and, you know, you get into more specifics, framing it, that creating an infrastructure where people's expectations are set in a realistic way, you know, so that you start out saying, look, we don't know everything. We're going to make mistakes. As more information comes in, we're going to change our recommendations. If people had that expectation, if they were told that at the beginning, then I think things would have been better. You know, I can remember one of those pandemic games was in Los Angeles. I don't remember the exact people involved. It was in California. And I gave a talk before the game started. And as usual, I talk about the importance of telling the truth. And the first move came, and the health commissioner, I forgot what county, got up and said, you know, there's an index case. You know, so he got up, and his first public statement was, well, this may not be the pandemic influenza. This may be something else. Well, you know, technically, that was the truth. But he's already behind the curve, and he's already lost the messaging game to, at that point, Facebook hardly existed. It was a while ago, but you've gotten my point. What his message should have been, we don't know if this is the case, but it really doesn't matter because it's coming here anyway. And we will know whether this is an index case or not after we run, you know, XYZ tests. We'll have those results in 10, 12, 14 hours. And the second we get the results, we're going to tell you. In the meantime, it doesn't matter because it's coming. You know, and I had just given the talk, and everybody had applauded wildly and agreed, including this gentleman.
Thank you very, very much. And I think we are really devoted to this frame that you have advocated for years. We very much appreciate your articulating it so well. And we hope, and we don't think it's too late to change course given the opportunities that technology and science that we have today allow us. In particular, the most important thing is that we can share the constructive experiences that have been successful in one place. The challenge that we face continues to be that people will adapt and learn from the experience that has worked, that you have tried to teach everyone for many years. Thank you very much, John, for what you've been doing, and thank you for joining us today.
Sure, you're welcome. Enjoyed it. Thanks for the questions.
Thank you, John.
Yes.
Thank you. Never quite had that talk before.
Fascinating talk. Thank you so much.